The following is an independently produced community access program. The viewpoints expressed are those of the community access producer and do not reflect those of Shaw Cable Systems. The program is presented in response to CRTC policy guidelines regulating community programming.
Fusing today has come a long way, and that is because there's a couple of companies in the United States who have created materials that it makes it much easier for us to fuse. The materials are coefficient. Coefficiency means that when the materials are heated up and cooled down, they will remain holding together and not break apart over time. It also means that the glass will not devitrify. That means getting a cloudy vapor look on the top of its surface. So this glass we have today is a coefficient glass. This is System 96. It's made by the Spectrum Glass Company. It's based out of Seattle, Washington. It is very good for fusing because it is very consistent in its color, and it heats and cools at the same level. Spectrum Glass is a company that's been around for many years. They make a lot of other sheet glass for stained glass hobbyists as well. You can use fusible glass for stained glass, but you cannot use stained glass for fusible glass. It doesn't go that way. This glass can be cut the very same way as stained glass, but stained glass will not heat and cool at the same rate. Thus, it'll fall apart in the kiln or after. There's another company called Bullseye Glass or System 90 Glass. It is a very interesting palette in that it seems to have more European type color sensibility. It is developed for artists, and we use it a lot in our studio as well. There are also other companies that do create fusible glass, and generally they team up with the System 90 or the System 96. But today we're going to use a System 96 glass to produce a little panel like this. And this panel has different kinds of transparencies of glass in it. We have opalescent glass. That is glass that has white in it so that you cannot see through it. And we also have some transparent glass, glass that will allow light to go through it. It's also often called cathedral glass. Now, cutting fused glass is very similar to cutting for stained glass, but there's a few other tools that we can use to produce different results. When I'm making this panel, what I have to do is think about cutting the triangle shapes in the flowers. So what I do for that is I start with a piece of glass, figure out approximately how big I want the petals, cut a strip, break it, and then I'm going to go back and forth to create the shapes. One thing nice about fusing something like this is that, unlike stained glass, you don't have to be completely accurate. So you can get a very nice result even if you're just a beginner starting out. So I'm going to use my hands, or I'm going to use some pliers to break apart the glass for the flower. I see I need about 8. Need a few more. They don't have to be perfect. If you want perfection, you can use a ruler or draw a line on the glass. But if you use a marker on your glass, you have to be very careful to get all the marker off before you fuse your piece. So I've got one flower, and another set of triangles. There, that should be enough for those. So those are the flower parts. And I have these two little globs. These are already manufactured by the Spectrum company. And they are compatible glass, not just your regular glass globs, but they are what I'll use for the center of the flowers. Spectrum has these little globs. Bullseye does not produce those. There's a lot of other different kinds of specialty glass that both companies produce, which I'll introduce in the next show. Now I'm going to make some of the background colors. So we have a turquoise. Actually, fusing is something we do a lot with children. Even though the glass cutting it can be sharp, there's no soldering or foiling involved, so children can do fusing. We have some grandchildren that love it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this cutter, and this is a mosaic cutter. And I start with a strip, and then I can produce little squares very, very quickly. And it's always good to have something to stop the glass. Often I use a cardboard box so it doesn't go into the next person's work zone. So I'll make a lot of these little pieces for the backgrounds. And the tiny, tiny pieces are made the same way. I'm using a piece of blue iridescent glass. So this glass is a transparent or cathedral glass, and it has a mother of pearl shine to it. You can tell the iridescent side with your fingernails. If you scrape it and you can hear it, you'll know it's iridescent. Drives some people crazy to hear that. It cuts it again the same way. I'll use the running pliers to get a tiny strip, and then I'll use these again to create small pieces. Oop. So you see, you don't have to be exact to do this mosaic type of cutting. You'll notice with our other two examples that I have here, the transparents on the clear and the opals on the opal, I used the very same technique to cut these. How I got these really nice long lines in here that are quite organic is I used this same tool, except I used a wider piece of glass, and you can get a nice long strip that are varying shapes. So that's how you create those shapes. Well, I'll just have to keep cutting and get some more material together. One thing that I think is very important about glass cutting is to always have eye protection. If you do not wear glasses, it's very important for you to cover your eyes. And another thing that I find out that people that come and take classes in the studio in the summer, they show up with sandals on their feet, and that's really not a good idea either. You should always have closed-toed shoes because glass does fall onto your feet. This is an interesting kind of glass. It's got a lot of sparkle to it. My granddaughter was helping me get these supplies together for the class, and this is her favorite. This pair of mosaic nippers is in this interesting additional tool. It was a creation of my son's, and it really helps with leverage because if you don't, if you keep on using your hands get very sore very quickly. Another safety measure, as you notice, there's a lot of different little shards of glass all over the table, and it's really important to keep your surfaces clean. What you want to do is use a brush and clean off your area. Never spread your pieces around with your hands. That's how you get cut. Get rid of all those little scraps of glass. People often ask us what we do with our scrap glass or little pieces. You can't recycle it, unfortunately. It's not taken because it's sharp little bits and of the color. So it just becomes part of landfill. Now I'm going to clean the glass and glue it to make this panel. The panel is not going to look exactly like this, but it'll look similar. Don't ever want to do anything exactly the same twice. What I use is a piece of coefficient 96 glass for the bottom. Yes, it's clear and it's made by the Spectrum company as well. Everything has to be coefficient. We use just ordinary window cleaner. One thing you have to try to avoid though is you don't want to leave any of the window cleaner on your glass. Some people tend to try to dilute it 50-50. You just don't want to have any cleaner left, but you want your glass to be very nice and clean. Even your fingerprints, even if your hands are clean, little oily fingerprints can show up on your glass as well. I've seen plates that had fingerprints in between the two pieces of glass. There's absolutely no way to get rid of it. Okay, pretty clean. The next step I do is I put a roll of tape down so I can put my clear glass on top of it. The reason I like to build on the surface is because when I go to pick it up, it's not stuck to the paper and it's very easy to move and bring up and down. Okay, now what we use for gluing is a fuser's glue. This one is made by the Hotline company. And what it does is that it doesn't set up right away. It doesn't become hard right away, but it will become sticky. And if left over a few hours, it will set up. The reason you should use a fuser's glue instead of any other kind of glue is that it will burn off in the kiln. If you have a glue that won't burn off, then you're going to be left with all sorts of marks and sticky situations. What I do in a situation like this is that I will start with my major image first. So I'll decide where the flowers are going to be placed on. Now I could use a different color for the back of this piece as well. I don't have to use clear. I could use white, which would work quite well. But I couldn't use black because I am using some transparent glass and it wouldn't show up against the black. So you'd have to use white or a very light color. A really simple way to put the glue on is to put a drop just right beside the glass, and you can see that the glue will wick underneath the piece of glass. We don't want a lot of glue, just a little bit. A little bit will do just fine. One more. Okay. Now the second flower. See, the glass still moves around. You can still manipulate it. it didn't go underneath, but it's okay. I'm not putting on too much. And maybe I can use that glue by pushing it into the center to put my center on. It'll help hold that down. I'll put this one on as well. Then I'd think about the stems, figure out how long I have to cut them. The nice thing about doing this mosaic style is you can be free. The piece I made, the example, is got not a lot of space in between the color. It's a lot of work to achieve that. You have to do lots of cutting and lots of placing. But when you're finished, you have a very even surface. If you don't place a lot of glass around the outside, your glass will tend to come in, bow in certain places where there isn't the mass to hold it. So if anything, you should always try to get a fair amount of glass around the outside of your piece so you can keep it square. So you can see if you have your glass cut already, if you didn't have to cut it, you could easily do this with children or anybody. Just make sure you have fusible glass that's coefficient, or everybody will be disappointed. The other really bad thing about introducing a piece of glass that isn't coefficient into the mix is that when things are lined up in the kiln, if you have incompatibility, it can blow apart and ruin the piece that's next to it. Got a little bit too much glue here because things are floating. So that's what happens when you add too much. So you can cut as you go, fill in the spaces. It's a nice break from stained glass because you don't have to be quite so accurate. Although we will introduce different fusing techniques that require a lot of accuracy. It's good that they don't set up right away because you can still move things around a tiny bit. What I try to do with the mosaic technique also is leave space in between the pieces of glass. That way you always have a negative space, and in the end it looks a lot better. If you have two pieces that are very close together and they kind of suction together in places and leave a area in between that isn't fused, it doesn't look as nice. But generally anything you do with fusing like this looks great. So to put on the background pieces, I'm going to just lay When I say mosaic technique, I'm just talking about using small pieces of glass to make a piece of art. There's many different kinds of materials you can use in mosaics. Again, we're floating, but it'll firm up.
Fused glass is a technique that has really gained in popularity in the last few years. It allows you to make bowls, platters, and wall pieces. This is a bowl that was made by an artist from the United States by the name of Tim O'Neill, who's been up to Winnipeg to do some workshops. When you look carefully, you can see that this is composed of many different thin strips of glass. The glass was cut in 1/4-inch strips, put on edge, and all the pieces were then stacked together, put in the kiln, fired so that they became one piece, cut into this round shape, and then finally slumped into a bowl to give us our final dimension. Very nice. It looked wonderful in the center of a table. Very similar piece here where he's used squares instead of the strips to create a very interesting looking piece. This one here, again, you can see many different versions of the bowls that he made using these strips. Color is usually used very solid colors with fused glass, which gives it a much more contemporary look than some of the streaky glass we use for stained glass. This is a very interesting technique. This is called raking. So again, you can see that all these strips were used to create the center part of this particular panel. And then while it's in the kiln and it's hot, we take a metal poker and you put the metal poker into the molten glass and you stretch it down. So in this case, the poker went to the top and it pulled down and kind of pulled everything out of space and created this real three-dimensional piece, which I think has a really wonderful movement to it. I really like that one. This is where actually glass powders were used to create the images on here. So generally what the artist does is make stencils, and then glass powder is applied to the top. Obviously some areas are much thicker than others, so you get the denser color. Other areas there's none whatsoever, so you get a really nice sharp contrast between the background and the foreground. This is an example of what you can do with different metal inclusions. This leaf is made out of copper. So the copper sheet was actually formed, first of all, it was cut out with scissors, and then you take a piece of a wooden stick or a pencil, you sharpen it, and you can do the incisions for the different veins in here. And then when you encase it in a piece of glass, it goes this wonderful reddish color. The glass behind it is many different types of iridescent glass. Iridescence is a particular film that is sprayed onto the glass when it's hot, and it gives us this interesting oil on water look, which can be very effective, especially in this kind of a piece. This is what Matthew McMillan calls his lentil bowls. He's made a number of these in different colors. So very similar concept where these were done flat, put into a mold to form them. The hole was cut out of the top using a drill with a special bit that is used for cutting glass. And then the two bowls, one on top of the other, were attached together to form a three-dimensional piece. Very nice for dried flowers, or you could even have live flowers in here with water. It is watertight. This is another piece that Matthew made where he used a saw to cut up this purple piece. He first of all fused all the glass together, slumped it over a round mold so they could get some contrast and contour to the shape, cut it up with a tile saw, and then this bottom section also was created out of glass. Tibor Bodie helped him with this, and they cast some glass to make a base for this, and then the two were married together to create a very dramatic and sculptural piece. These are some other pieces that Matthew did. They're signs, which again, he made these fused pieces that were used for the focal point of this particular sign. So you can see there is the cross on the back, there is a white section for the one animal, and then the cat in the front is another piece of similar blue glass to the background. In this next slide, you can see better how that was used to its full potential. This is an example of a funeral urn that we've made. This particular person grew up in the prairie, so you can see wheat was embossed onto the one side of the urn. On the other side is the family tree. You can see all the little dots representing the mother, the father, the parents, and all the grandchildren. This particular person was also an engineer, so on the back there's a number of cogs that relate to the work that he did during his life. And he very proudly worked for the province of Manitoba, so there are some other images that relate to the province of Manitoba on a fourth side.
So now we have all the pieces glued onto the base plate. It's ready to get into the kiln. What we're going to use to put in the kiln is a kiln shelf. Now this kiln shelf has a kiln wash on it. It's just been washed and it's this pink color. It's because of the kiln wash that we choose to use. It's made for glass and it's also produced by the Bullseye Company. Once it's fired, it turns a white color. You don't have to prime your shelf each time you use it, but you should clean them and prime them when you start seeing that the primer is starting to chip off. So we have a nice primed shelf, and then on top of that we're going to put in some kiln paper. The kiln paper prevents the glass from sticking into the kiln shelf. Even though it has a layer of primer on it, that still could happen. And the really nice thing about the kiln paper is that it will always leave a very flat, shiny back surface to the pieces. So they'll be nice and even, nice and flat and even, and not have the texture of the kiln shelf. That's important. So I'm going to cut a piece out that is just slightly larger than our piece we're making. Put it on the shelf. Now I'm going to make a hanger. You can see the end result, the finished product, has this hanger at the top, and it's made again with the same glass that I used for the base. It is 96 compatible glass. I cut a strip about 1/2 inch. You could use a ruler for this to make sure it's nice and even. But the 30 years experience is coming in handy right now. So this piece has to be the same width as the panel. I'm going to put it down first. And this is where that roll of tape comes in really handy, because I can just pick up a piece right on the side, not get fingerprints on the back, and nothing falls out. So I'm going to put it down. Well, I forgot a step. This is good. A few things moved. I actually want to cut the rails first. Put them down underneath. Make sure you have even spacing. I line it up like this so that when you hang it up, you can put your piece of fish line around here and up and here, so it will hang evenly. If I move these out to the ends, you'd have trouble doing that. Now, I pick up the piece of glass and set it right on the rails. So this is ready to be fired in the kiln. It'll take about 24 hours for it to heat up and cool down. And when it's finished, this is the final product, or it will look very similar to this final product. Thank you for watching this show, and we'll see you next show with some more fusing information.
The proceeding was an independently produced community access program. The viewpoints expressed are those of the community access producer and do not reflect those of Shaw Cable Systems. The program is presented in response to CRTC policy guidelines regulating community programming.